Gary, Indiana, 1963. The air inside Roosevelt High School's auditorium hung heavy with anticipation and a mingled sense of floor polish, cheap perfume, and the nervous sweat of performers waiting backstage. Outside, the industrial city continued its relentless rhythm. Steel mills belching smoke into the gray sky, factory whistles marking the changing shifts, workers trudging home with coal dust still clinging to their clothes. Inside, however, time seemed suspended as the annual talent show prepared to begin. Parents and siblings, neighbors and friends filled the worn wooden seats, programs rustling in their hands, voices creating a gentle hum of expectation. They had come for an evening's entertainment, a brief respite from the harsh realities of life in a struggling steel town. None suspected they were about to witness the first public performance of a child who would one day transform global culture, a moment that would be remembered, analyzed, and celebrated decades after the school itself had crumbled to dust. In the narrow backstage corridor, far from the audience's view, 5-year-old Michael Joseph Jackson stood absolutely still, his small body rigid with fear, his enormous eyes wide with an anxiety so profound it seemed to vibrate from his tiny frame. The Jackson brothers, Jackie, Tito, and Jermaine, huddled nearby, their own nervousness temporarily forgotten as they watched their youngest brother with growing concern. At 11, Jackie had assumed the mantle of leader, both on stage and in the complex family dynamic that defined their home life. "It's okay, Michael," he whispered, kneeling to meet his brother's eyes. "Just like we practiced. You don't even have to look at the people. Just look at me." Michael nodded, but the terror remained etched on his face, an expression jarringly incongruous on features otherwise defined by childlike softness, by the wide-eyed innocence of kindergarten age. This was not the typical stage fright of a child about to perform in a school talent show. This was something deeper, more complex, the anxiety of a perfectionist trapped in a 5-year-old's body, already burdened with expectations far beyond his years. What the audience waiting beyond the stage curtain couldn't know, what would remain hidden from the public narrative for decades, was the intense pressure that had preceded this moment. Joseph Jackson, the family patriarch, sat in the front row, his posture military straight, his expression revealing nothing of the emotional investment he had placed in his son's performance. A former boxer and crane operator at the nearby steel plant, Joseph had channeled his own thwarted musical ambitions into his children, fashioning a family band through a combination of genetic good fortune, relentless rehearsal, and a discipline so strict it bordered on tyranny. The evidence of this approach was visible in the way young Michael's eyes constantly darted to the stage entrance, checking and rechecking for his father's presence. His small shoulders hunched as if perpetually braced for criticism or correction. Catherine Jackson, Michael's mother, sat beside her husband, a gentle face containing both anticipation and concern. Where Joseph drove the children with uncompromising standards, Catherine had provided the emotional ballast, the encouragement, the spiritual foundation, the occasional protective intervention when Joseph's methods threatened to cross from discipline into something more troubling. Tonight, watching her youngest son about to join his brothers on stage for the first time in public, her hands twisted the program in her lap, her prayers a silent counterpoint to Joseph's rigid expectations. She alone fully understood what this moment meant, not just for the family's aspirations or Joseph's ambitions, but for little Michael himself, whose sensitivity made him simultaneously the most vulnerable to pressure and potentially the most gifted of all her children. The talent show progressed through its typical procession, piano recitals of varying competence, a girl performing baton twirling to recorded music, a teenager reading poetry of earnest, if limited literary merit. The audience responded with the generous applause of a community supporting its young, the low expectations of a local school event making each performance a success by the simple metric of completion. Then came the announcement, and now, from Gary's own Jackson family, please welcome the Jackson brothers, featuring for the first time 5-year-old Michael Jackson. A ripple of anticipation moved through the audience. The Jackson brothers had developed a local reputation through performances at small venues and previous talent shows, but the addition of the kindergartner was a new development, a novelty that piqued interest. As his older brothers walked confidently onto the stage, taking positions behind instruments or microphones, Michael remained frozen in the wings, his small body seemingly unable to translate thought into movement. A stagehand, noticing the child's paralysis, gently placed a hand. Jackie, seeing his brother's distress, smoothly adjusted the introduction, extending it by several measures to give Michael time to find his position, to remember the carefully rehearsed choreography that had been drilled into him through countless hours in their living room. Ladies and gentlemen, Jackie announced with a showmanship that belied his 11 years, "We're going to climb every mountain from the sound of music. And our little brother Michael is going to help us out tonight." This departure from the planned introduction, they had rehearsed a simple listing of the song title, was Jackie's instinctive effort to normalize Michael's obvious terror, to present it as part of the act rather than a child on the verge of flight or tears. In that moment, Jackie demonstrated the protective instinct that would define the brothers' relationship with Michael throughout their careers, the understanding that their youngest sibling required both pushing to overcome his shyness and shielding from its most paralyzing effects. If this story moves you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more untold stories from music history. Moments when legendary careers hung in the balance, when small decisions changed the course of cultural history. These glimpses into the vulnerable beginnings of artistic icons remind us that even the most extraordinary journeys begin with simple, human moments of courage and fear. The band began to play, the familiar notes of the Rodgers and Hammerstein classic filling the modest auditorium. The older brothers launched into their parts with practiced coordination, their harmonies revealing the hours of rehearsal Joseph had demanded, their movements displaying the disciplined choreography that already distinguished them from typical school talent show fare. Michael remained motionless, head still bowed, seemingly forgotten the entire performance strategy. In the front row, Joseph's expression darkened, his disappointment and anger visible to Catherine, who placed a restraining hand on his arm, a silent plea for patience, for understanding of their youngest child's overwhelming fear. Then came the moment, the pivot point between what had been and what would be, the instant that those present would later recall with the particular clarity reserved for witnessing history before it was recognized as such. Jackie, continuing to perform his own part, moved closer to Michael and whispered something inaudible to the audience. Michael looked up, meeting his brother's eyes, receiving some private communication that seemed to transform him from within. His posture straightened slightly, his death grip on the microphone loosened, and when the time came for his part, a brief solo section Joseph had assigned to showcase the unusual vocal abilities he had recognized in his youngest son, Michael finally opened his mouth to sing. The sound that emerged from that small body struck the audience with almost physical force. Rich, perfectly pitched, carrying emotional nuance that seemed impossible from a kindergartner, Michael's voice filled the auditorium with a maturity and control that defied explanation. The audience's reaction was immediate, a collective intake of breath, a shifting forward in seats, the particular electric attention that accompanies witnessing something extraordinary in the most ordinary of settings. The contrast between the visual, a tiny, clearly terrified child, and the oral, a voice of remarkable power and expressiveness, created a cognitive dissonance that heightened the impact of the performance. People exchanged glances of disbelief, of confirmation that they were indeed hearing what they thought they were hearing. Most remarkable was the transformation in Michael himself. As he continued to sing, as the audience's reaction registered in his consciousness, something shifted in his demeanor. His eyes, still wide, now held something beyond fear, a dawning recognition of his own effect on the room, a first taste of the particular power that comes from moving others through artistic expression. His small body, previously rigid with terror, began to move slightly with the music, not yet the fluid dance that would later become his signature, but the instinctive physical response of someone who feels music not just audibly but kinesthetically, who experiences rhythm as an invitation to movement. By the time the song reached its conclusion, with Michael's voice soaring through the final refrain with a confidence that seemed to have materialized from nowhere, the audience's response had built from surprise to genuine appreciation to something approaching awe. The applause that followed wasn't the polite acknowledgement of a school talent show, but the genuine, spontaneous response to witnessing unexpected excellence. People rose to their feet, their ovation carrying both appreciation for what they had just experienced and the particular pride of a community recognizing extraordinary talent emerging from unlikely soil. In the front row, Joseph's face revealed a complex mixture of emotions. Pride, yes, but also a calculated assessment, a recognition of potential that aligned with his own ambitious vision. Beside him, Catherine wept openly, her response not to the performance's quality, but to the transformation she had witnessed in her youngest child, the glimpse of a gift so powerful it had momentarily overcome even his profound anxiety. Backstage, after the show, Michael was unusually quiet, even for a child known for his silence, his observant nature. While his brothers celebrated their successful performance with the easy camaraderie of siblings who had shared a victory, Michael sat slightly apart, his expression thoughtful beyond his years. When a teacher approached to compliment him, he responded with shy gratitude, but his attention seemed turned inward, processing something significant. Years later, in one of his rare reflective interviews, he would describe this moment. That was when I first understood what it meant to connect through performance. I was so scared I could barely breathe, but then something happened. This energy came from the audience and went through me and back to them. I was 5 years old, but I knew right then that this was what I was born to do. In the family's modest home on Jackson Street that night, after the younger children had been put to bed, Joseph and Catherine had a rare disagreement about what Michael's performance signified. Joseph saw confirmation of his approach, the strict discipline, the relentless rehearsals, the uncompromising standards he had imposed. Catherine saw something more spiritual, more innate, a gift that had emerged not because of the pressure, but despite it, a talent that would flourish best with nurturing rather than driving. Neither perspective was entirely right or wrong. What had revealed itself on that high school auditorium stage was both the result of disciplined preparation and the emergence of something that transcended training, that couldn't be manufactured or programmed even by the most ambitious parent. What they had witnessed was the first public flowering of a rare artistic spirit that would eventually reach beyond their family, beyond Gary, beyond the contemporary understanding of what a performer could be or do. News of the Jackson brothers' performance, specifically of the extraordinary youngest member, spread through Gary with the particular efficiency of small-town communication. Invitations followed for local events, for parties, for community gatherings. Joseph, recognizing opportunity, began seeking engagements beyond their immediate area, leveraging each performance into slightly larger venues, slightly more prominent showcases. The path that would eventually lead to Motown, to global fame, to the complete transformation of popular music and performance had begun on that modest stage in Roosevelt High School, with a terrified 5-year-old finding his voice despite paralyzing fear. What no one present that night could have predicted. Not Joseph with his driving ambition, not Catherine with her protective concern, not Michael's brothers with their instinctive support, not even Michael himself with his precocious self-awareness, was how completely that voice would eventually reshape cultural history. The child who had barely found the courage to step onto a high school stage would one day command the world's largest venues, would pioneer performance techniques and musical approaches still studied and emulated decades later, would achieve a level of global recognition unprecedented in entertainment history. But contained within that future icon was always the paradox witnessed on that first night. Extraordinary gifts paired with profound vulnerability, supernatural talent housed in a deeply sensitive human spirit. Years later, long after the Jackson 5 had conquered Motown, after Michael had established himself as a solo artist of unprecedented success. After the evolution from child performer to global phenomenon was complete, echoes of that first performance remained visible to those who knew where to look. The contrast between offstage shyness and onstage transformation. The perfectionism that drove relentless rehearsal. The momentary hesitation, sometimes visible before he surrendered to the music's demand for expression. These elements, softened by experience and professionalism, but never entirely absent, formed a thread connecting the megastar to the frightened child, a reminder that even the most extraordinary artistic journeys begin with simple human courage. The decision to step forward despite fear, to offer one's voice despite uncertainty about its reception. When Michael returned to Gary in 2003, nearly 40 years after that first talent show performance, he visited Roosevelt High School, by then closed and falling into disrepair. Standing in the empty auditorium, surrounded by dust and peeling paint rather than the polished splendor of the stadiums he usually commanded, he was observed to become unusually quiet. His gaze turned inward, as if seeing not the abandoned building before him, but the echoes of that pivotal evening. "Everything started here," he told the small group accompanying him. "I was so scared I thought I might die. But then I sang, and something happened that I can't explain, like I found the real me for the first time." He walked to center stage, stood for a moment in the spot where his 5-year-old self had discovered his voice, his calling, his destiny. Then, in a gesture that moved his companions to tears, he performed a brief a cappella verse of "Climb Every Mountain," his adult voice, with all its earned control and expressiveness, honoring the terrified child who had found the courage to sing despite his fear, to begin a journey that would eventually encompass the globe. If this video has touched you, if it has reminded you that even the most extraordinary journeys begin with small moments of courage, please like and subscribe. Share it with someone who might need encouragement to take their own first step, to find their own voice despite fear or doubt. And remember that behind every legendary performance, every cultural icon, every transformative artistic career lies a beginning that was simply human, a moment when someone chose to move forward despite uncertainty, to offer their gift despite the very real possibility of rejection or failure. In that choice, that courage, that willingness to risk vulnerability for the sake of authentic expression, we find not just the seeds of extraordinary achievement, but the essence of what makes art meaningful, what allows it to connect us across time and circumstance, what enables it to remind us of our shared humanity beyond the divisions that so often define us. In a small museum now established in the Jackson family's former home on Jackson Street, visitors can see photographs from those earliest performances, including rare images from the Roosevelt High Talent Show. What strikes most observers is the contrast captured in those grainy black and white pictures. The obvious terror in young Michael's expression alongside the unmistakable power of his performance stance. A visitor once asked the museum's curator, a former classmate of the Jackson children, what she remembered most clearly about that night. "The silence," she replied without hesitation. "There was this moment when he first began to sing, when the entire room went completely still, like everyone collectively held their breath. We didn't have the words for it then, but we knew we were witnessing something extraordinary, something that didn't quite belong in our little corner of Indiana." She gestured toward the photographs on the wall, her expression reflecting both pride in her community's connection to cultural history and wonder at the transformation that had begun in that modest auditorium. Who could have known? This little frightened boy who could barely look up from his shoes, who seemed like he might bolt from the stage at any moment. He was already carrying all that future brilliance inside him. He just needed that first moment of courage to let it out.